Let's see what we've got here. And we'll open this up and try to get us going here. There we are. All right, so basically, as you know, you're going to be doing the classical model. That's the method that you're going to be following. Now, you know that in the classical methods or the classical models, there are actually several different methods. The one we're looking at right now, your textbook just lists as ancient rhetoric, and that's fine enough. Traditional rhetoric, ancient rhetoric, however you want to think of that. There are a couple of other models there, a couple of other methods in this this group of classical methods, and we will look at those as the time comes, but we will be focused here on the classical method that is going to focus on the old Greek terminology. So we'll want to remember that there are 4 steps you're going to take, and I want to make sure there's no confusion out there on this front either. Essentially, you're going to describe your artifact. I've had more than one email from folks for whom the idea of description and analysis seems to be confused in your minds. Okay, so these are 2 very different steps. So description is what happens first, and that description is, by the way, due. It should have been done already, right? So that should have been turned in. What you should be working on right now will be your analysis. So we're going to assume that this part is finished and in the bag, and you are right now working on this, analyze your artifact. That's what we're going to be focusing on today, is that idea of analyzing the artifact. So artifact analysis, let's take a look at that. Of these, I want to pause before we go on just a moment to look at that third one and just remind you that this third one, where you're going to make judgments about your rhetorical artifact or event, what your textbook calls interpretation evaluation. Remember, that's off in the future. What we are going to do first is describe the artifact, which you've done. You're going to analyze the artifact, which will come in a week from Monday, and then we're going to make these judgments. You're going to get your description and your analysis returned to you, and when it is returned to you, you're going to take those 2 elements and you're going to write this third element and attach them all together, put on a nice introduction and a tidy little conclusion at the end, and that's your 1A. All right, so that's how this works. Description, analysis, and then 3 is interpretation and evaluation. We're going to put all of them together to make your essay 1A. When we look here, then we've got these 3 steps, and obviously right now we're focused on this analysis, analyze the artifact, because that is what we are doing right now. So let's talk about analyzing the artifact. That's what we're emphasizing. Remember, there are steps you're going to take. Now, these are the steps inside your analysis that's happening right now, okay? And you're going to name a rhetorical device. Step 1. Step 2, you're going to tell how that rhetorical device generally functions. That means you're going to give us a definition of what that rhetorical device is, and you're going to tell us, what does it usually do? What do rhetoricians do with it? And we want here just as a general discussion, okay? It's all about the device itself at that point. Then your next step, we move to your specific artifact, and you tell us about the device inside your artifact and how it's working there. Okay, that's these 2 steps here and here. Tell how the device generally functions, tell how the device functions in your specific artifact. Those 2 steps are the bulk of your discussion when you're doing analysis. Finally, what you'll do, and I want to emphasize here, I cannot emphasize enough, suggest how the presence of that device is nudging the audience toward the thesis, but just suggest right now. Don't try to explain it. Just give a hint. Just make the tiniest, simplest, smallest suggestion, okay? Because when we get into this idea of how this device is moving the audience toward the thesis, and we begin to unpack that in more depth, that's going to be that bridge that's going to carry us over into the judgments we'll be making. Okay, so that's the bridge that carries us forward. All right, so great. That said, we found ourselves, okay, great, that's what I'm supposed to do. I know it's all about rhetorical devices, but I don't know what a rhetorical device is. So what am I supposed to do with that?
Sure.
Is an artistic or crafted, there's artistry involved. There's some kind of artistry or crafting of language or of a material object too, sometimes. But for us, it's of language by a rhetor to move an audience toward the telos or the purpose of that rhetorical artifact. That's a rhetorical device. Anything that has been crafted, designed to move an audience toward the telos or purpose of that rhetorical artifact. That is our definition of a rhetorical artifact. That's what we're looking at. Now, the key here, of course, is that idea of telos or purpose. And just to remind you, we said very quickly, and we'll just breeze through these right now. We said, there are very general purposes that rhetorical artifacts are crafted to fulfill. And then there are very specific purposes. Let's look at each of those in sequence. So, general purposes. A rhetorical artifact might be asking you to do something. It might be saying that we want you to take a certain kind of action. That's deliberative. Okay, it's sometimes called political communication. Take action, do or don't do. Okay, there's also another kind of general purpose that's out there, and that's called forensic. And forensic or judicial rhetoric is where we try to convince you that something is or is not so, that this is true or this is not true. And that's what we try to convince you of. That guides us through forensic rhetoric. Now, it's important that you have kind of an idea what the general purpose is of your artifact. When we begin to focus in on the specific purposes, we'll talk more about that, but the general purpose will help guide you toward understanding the specific purpose. There's a third general purpose, of course, we talked about, and that's epideictic, ceremonial rhetoric, it's sometimes called. And that's where we celebrate shared values, we celebrate shared perspectives. So when the president of our university stands up and gives a presentation to us at convocation or at graduation, he's celebrating our shared identity and shared values. So those are all aspects of what constitutes the general purposes. But behind those general purposes, there are, of course, specific purposes. All right. So the general purposes are out there: deliberative, forensic, epideictic. But where we really want to focus is on the specific purpose of your artifact, that specific purpose, or its telos, its thesis, in a word. That's where we want to begin unpacking what happens. All right. We have said that when a rhetor takes a look at things, they're going to basically be making artistic choices. In other words, they're going to craft their language, they're going to craft their material, and they're going to do that in 5 very specific areas. In other words, there are 5 places you can go to find rhetorical devices. Okay, so 5 areas you can look for rhetorical devices. In those 5 areas, we can start with invention. Okay, invention just means going out, finding the reasons to embrace the telos, gathering up as many reasons as you can. Arrangement. In arrangement, we're basically choosing the best reasons that we can, and we're trying to order those reasons in a powerful way. That's arrangement. Style is essentially choosing the best way to present the reasons. And here we're emphasizing words. We're emphasizing word choices. We're emphasizing phrases that we might turn. We're going to spend a good bit of time on style today. These first 3 are probably where most of you are going to work. Now, there are two other areas, and we want to touch on them really quickly here. Delivery, which is essentially the media, the actual performance, the presentation of the artifact itself. And then there is what's called memory. And delivery and memory we'll talk about just again briefly at the end. But essentially, memory is what the rhetor does to help the audience internalize or make real to themselves the issues that have been discussed here. All right. So those are the 5 areas. We're going to take a look at especially those first 3 and especially that third one, style, in more depth right now. So invention, we've already talked about that, and we're just going to go back through it, refresh our memory, and sort of expand our vocabulary a little bit on it. When we talk about devices, rhetorical devices that are present in invention, those rhetorical devices have a name. We call them enthymemes. And there it is in front of you. An enthymeme is essentially any set of reasons that you're given, any line of reasoning that brings you to, that is supposed to bring you to the telos, the purpose, the thesis of this artifact. So anything that a rhetor does to try and draw you together, it's essentially, enthymemes are just good reasons that the rhetor thinks you should take into account when you make your decision here. So it's just the set of good reasons that you should embrace the telos. That's the point. That's the purpose here. We've said that those reasons usually come in 3 particular lines. You know, you can get logos. So here are your devices, logos. So if you were going to do a rhetorical analysis with the classical method, and you were going to focus on invention as a field for finding rhetorical devices, one rhetorical device you might find is a line of reasoning, logos. And logos is simply a demonstration that what my thesis isn't crazy. It makes perfect sense. I've got really excellent, rational, thoughtful, considered reasons for saying this is true, or you ought to do this, or this is, you know, why we're all together and share these values. Okay. It is that sense of it being reasonable, rational, thought out, makes sense, hangs together. Those are logos enthymemes. They're logical enthymemes. They're enthymemes that depend on the idea of a disciplined, structured, careful, considered reasoning in order to move us and move the audience toward that telos, that thesis. So we start with logos. Right up against logos, obviously, there's another one, pathos. Pathos is also an enthymeme. That is to say, it's an inventional rhetorical device. So it's a rhetorical device that we find in invention. It's an enthymematic rhetorical device. Pathos is an appeal to emotion. Now that you see this is true, don't you understand how terrible this is? Shouldn't we do something about it? It's that, don't you understand how terrible this is? That's pathos. That's a pathetic appeal. It's an enthymeme that's wrapped around the idea that your emotional life, your view of the world from your sense of what's valuable and proper and disgusting and terrible, all of those have been trained. And we can sort of hopefully depend on you to be disgusted by certain things that are disgusting. And we count on that when we make a pathetic appeal. So if you are dealing with devices of pathos, you might very well find appeals to the emotions. You will find appeals to doing the right thing. You'll find appeals to relieve your own guilt. You'll find appeals to address and fix somebody else's guilt. You will find all of those things will play heavily in pathetic appeals. Now, of course, not surprisingly, there's a third, ethos. And ethos is simply the sort of enthymeme that is rooted in the fact that we have well-established customs that have made this work. We have long proven institutions that help guide us in times of crisis and difficulty. It's that sense that this can be trusted. And of course, a rhetor who's standing up, they will want to build their own private ethos. So ethos happens both at this sort of cultural level here we, as the sort of people who are joined together in this nation, we trust these ideas. We bank on, we give confidence to these institutions and these documents. That's what guides our common life together. That's a cultural level of ethos, but there's also a personal level of ethos where the rhetor themselves will want to show that they are trustworthy. Now, how does a rhetor show that they're trustworthy? Well, that's a good question. One way they do it is they show that they have thought clearly about the topic at hand. And they show that their feelings are both in control. I'm not up here as a wild person. I have been reflective and thoughtful, and my feelings are in control, but they are simmering. They're just right on the point of boiling about just the right thing. Okay, so show that I have reflected and that I have felt properly, appropriately about my topic. And that will build my own personal ethos. So if you are doing these kinds of divisions, essentially what you are looking at will be places where invention will be building enthymemes. Those enthymemes are essentially lines of reason. They're good reasons to embrace something. They happen in logos, they happen in pathos, they happen in ethos. Those constitute enthymematic evidence or proofs. Now, don't get hung up on this idea of proofs here. Okay, we don't mean scientific proof. We mean just evidence. When a rhetor says we have these proofs, it comes from an old use of the word, and it just means evidence. Okay, not something that you can absolutely, it's not a geometric proof or a scientific proof. It just means that we have rhetorical evidence, enthymemes. Now, you could, as a critic, you might pick up this idea of ethos and you might say, hey, what devices, what ethos, what ethical devices, what enthymemes of ethos do I find where the rhetor is building their personal ethos? And then compare that to what ethical devices do I see that they're tapping into in terms of our culture or our shared identity? What's going on with that? So how do they build this sense that you can trust me and we're all in this together? Maybe that's a tension in your piece. Maybe you want to talk about how logos or pathos is dominant. Maybe you have an artifact that is overwhelmingly pathetic or overwhelmingly logical. Why? That's a really interesting question. If you find yourself with an artifact that's overwhelmingly one or the other, all artifacts have all three in them, okay? It's virtually impossible to build an artifact that doesn't touch all three. But if you have an artifact that's overwhelmingly heavy on one of these three, begin in the back of your mind. You don't have to answer that in analysis. You should not try to answer that in analysis, but you should be thinking in the back of your mind, why am I seeing so much pathos? Why am I seeing so much logos? Question. The analysis certainly points out, here is logos, and here's how this logos is functioning. And it's very interesting because there are an overwhelming number of logical enthymemes in this artifact. Okay, that's all analysis. Okay, analysis is straightforward. Remember, analysis, like description, shouldn't be open to a lot of debate. There are a million things you can do in analysis, but there isn't really any room for interpretation. There isn't any room for a judgment call. If you say this artifact is overwhelmingly logical, or this artifact is overwhelmingly pathetic in its appeals, then if I were to hand your artifact off to somebody else and say, hey, which is heavier here, logos, pathos, or ethos? They should read it and come to the same conclusion. Analysis is not open for discussion or debate. You're still telling me things that are there. Now, you may choose to focus on logos, and somebody else may choose to focus on style. Okay, so you're going to come at this from many, many different angles, but the claims you make in your analysis should be claims that anyone who was analyzing your document would agree with. Okay? So save the, I wonder why they did this. I wonder what their motives were. Save that for our third step. Right now, tell me about the device that's there. Name it. Tell me how devices like that work. Show me how they're working inside your device, and just suggest to me how that kind of would help an audience move toward the telos. Spend your time in that step 2, step 3. Step 1 is one sentence, right? Name the device, one sentence. How is it nudging the audience? One sentence, 2 maybe at the end. Those will be sentences you'll come back to and expand later. Why? But now there are 2 whys here. There are 2 ways to hear why. How does this help the audience move toward the thesis? Okay, that's legitimate analysis. Why would the writer have chosen to make things pathetically heavy instead of tipping more into logos, I wonder? That's where you're getting into interpretation and analysis. So don't talk to me about motives. Talk to me about how doing that moves the audience. That's a subtle difference. We'll get to more of that difference when we pick up the world of interpretation and evaluation. We'll do it anyway. Okay, so let's think about it this way. I would have an example that might run something like this. I am going to analyze the use of logos in this paper. Okay, now I've named a device. I will be or then I've got to tell you what the device is. Logos means an appeal that is designed by the writer to move the audience toward their conclusion so that they will embrace the thesis, so that they will say yes to the purpose of the artifact. Logos works by demonstrating that there are good, rational, solid reasons for embracing the telos. Now, whatever the telos is, you're going to have to, you pick that up. Whatever the telos is, that's what you're naming here. So if the telos of my speech is, you should support the national parks. You should make a contribution to the National Park Service. Okay, if that's my thesis, then I'm going to say, I'm analyzing an artifact where the goal of the artifact is to have me make a contribution to the National Park Service. And I'm very interested in the logical appeals here. So I want to look at logos. Logos means the presentation of good reasons that make sense and are rational in order to make a contribution to the National Park Service. There are a number of ways that logos can move one. Logos can show you that that this makes sense. Logos can show you that this is in your own self-interest. Logos can show you that doing this will not be harmful or hurt you very much, even though it might seem like it would at first. So all of those would be logical appeals, right? Logos, logos, logos. I'm giving you logical reasons. So now I've basically named a device and told you a little bit about how that device functions. Obviously, you're going to tell me more. You're going to develop that. You're going to talk about it a little bit more. And then you're going to say, I want to look particularly at 3 examples of logos in my artifact. Okay. Then I'm going to say in paragraph 11, there's an example of logos where the writer states. And then you're going to say, here's the logical appeal. You certainly can. You might do 3 examples of logos. You could also do, I want to compare logos and pathos. So then you would have 2 devices, logos, pathos, and you're going to tell me how they work together. It's going to depend on basically what you see this thing doing, okay? Now, if it's doing something without any depth, then don't write about it, okay? But if you've found an artifact and it's got a device in it, pathos here, let's say, and you're really able to say, wow, I see which emotion is being tapped into here. I see how that emotion, I see how creating that sense of anger, for example, would move the audience toward making a contribution to the national forest. Or I see how that emotion, if we're doing pathos in the national park speech, right, or essay or editorial. So if I say I see in here a sense of adventure, they're appealing to my restlessness, my autumn lust, my desire for adventure. That's what they're calling out. Okay, I can see how once that's roused, that would lead a person to say, wow, yeah, I want to protect the wild places, because someday, I mean, not now, not today, of course, but someday I'm going to get out there and I'm going to live the adventurous life. I'm going to hike and spend 35 days alone in the wilderness. That's going to happen someday. So I'm going to help support that. So we tap into the emotions, and we say, I mean, we tap into the emotional appeals. Name the emotional appeal. I'm going to look at pathetic appeals. Then you tell how pathetic appeals work. By rousing emotions, people can be more excited. They're more enthusiastic about what they do. They act faster, more quickly. So arousing emotion is a good thing to do if you're a Rhetor. Now I'm going to tell you about the specific emotions that were aroused in this presentation. Anger. Anger worked. I saw that the national parks were under threat, so that would make me want to respond. A desire for adventure. That was stirred up inside me. Oh, okay, I can see how that would work. That would make me want to protect the national parks. And so now I'm naming the specific examples. Now, obviously, I'm naming them here and just moving on to the next one. Obviously, when you're writing your paper, you name that specific example. You tell me where it is in the artifact. You tell me how it got there, what led into it, what makes it particularly powerful. Maybe you want to talk about where it was placed. And you develop the discussion about that emotional appeal inside your artifact. And then you say, hey, doing those kinds of emotional appeals, having that kind of emotion present in me now, could clearly lead me to embrace the thesis. There was another question out there. Let's hear it. No, let's stop there. Their main point is not a rhetorical device. Okay. Okay, so let's think about how we're using the word main point here. So let's think about it this way. First of all, there is a thesis or a telos. Okay, that's the thing they want you to do. All right. So far, so good. Yes. Do we understand the difference between the thesis and main points? Okay, so those are not the same thing. So the thesis is a single, simple, declarative sentence of what this artifact wants from you. What do they want from you? Well, in this case, they want me to. You should be able to finish that sentence about your artifact. This artifact wants me to what? That's the thesis. Now, they're going to structure for you a series of ideas, supports for why that makes sense, why that's a good idea, why should you do it. And maybe here's where we're getting a little confused. Each main point that they give you is likely to be, won't always be, we'll talk about arrangement here coming up in just a second, but each main point that they give you should be a summary, a statement, a sort of miniature thesis about why doing the thesis would be a good idea. So if I've got an artifact that says, you should make a contribution to the National Park Service, and I've got a main point that says, one, the National Park Service is under attack by evil corporations. Okay, so we got to protect it. And second, another reason you should make a contribution is because the National Park Service is a beautiful place. It has open spaces. It's a glorious spot for you to go fulfill your desires and your adventures. And three, there's a third reason that you should be supporting the National Park Service and making a contribution. And that third reason is that the National Park Service is good for communities. Okay, yeah, there are great, deep wild, uncharted adventures out there, but they're also family campgrounds and groups of people get together. So it really builds community. So it's a great place to support. So now I've tapped into 3 reasons. Okay. Are those rhetorical devices? No, they're statements that I'm giving you saying, hey, you should go support the National Park Service because they need your help, because you want to, deep down inside, you want to be an adventurer, and because they build communities and they're great for doing that. Okay, so now I've made 3 statements. Those aren't devices. They're just statements that I've given. Your job as the critic is to go and say, number 1, I should give money to the National Park Service because the Park Service is under threat. That's a logical appeal. That's your job as the critic. Now you've picked up the main point. You should make a contribution because the National Park Service is under threat. I have now been given a logos device. I've been given a logical enthemy. I can show you how the Park Service is under threat, and that means there's a good logical reason for you to make the contribution. Now you're starting analysis. If you just tell me, they said I ought to make a contribution because the national parks were under threat, all you're doing there is just repeating what they said. The critic goes beyond repetition of what was said, and the critic tells me what that is. What's the device that's there? How does a device like that work? How does it work here in this artifact? Okay, and that working, how does doing that move us? Now, then you would go on to the next main point, perhaps. And when we talk about the appeals here, obviously it's not necessarily just the statement of the main point. It may be many, many things that are said underneath that main point. So sometimes you get things that look like logical appeals, but when we start reading between the lines, we discover, that's actually a pathetic appeal. They started out saying that they were going to make sense and that this was all going to come together and be perfectly rational, but they keep hitting my heart, not my head. Okay, so that's something that a critic goes out, explores, finds, discovers. All right, so the main point will give us a reason. The main point is one of the things the rhetor said, that the rhetor says, here's a reason you ought to embrace my thesis. Okay, that's a main point. Your job as the critic is to get in there and say, okay, what kind of main point is that? What does it do? What is it? How do those things work? Does that? Okay, so we kind of had invention. We've sort of beaten invention to death. Let's talk a little bit about arrangement here. So arrangement is the second. We said there are 5 areas in which the rhetor is going to be making choices and building devices. Okay, arrangement is another one, and it's a really interesting area, but we're going to go through it really quickly, and I want to make a couple of quick points here. One, there are about 6 of these, 5, 6 of them, 6 if we count right. So basically, it may be that you have a problem solution. It may be that your artifact is out there to compare one thing to another, or tell what the similarities or differences are, compare and contrast. That's another way to arrange the material inside the artifact. You could be talking about causes. How did we get here? What caused this to happen? Or your rhetor may be talking about what they're going to do next, right? what will flow from this? What will the effect of our actions be? That's another kind of arrangement. Sometimes you'll be given chronological arrangements. This step led to this step, led to this step. This is how the murder happened. You get the countdown on the clock. Also geographic arrangements. Here we're going to talk about, economic disparities, and we're going to look at the South, the West, and the Northeast. Okay. Well, that's a geographic or a spatial arrangement. And finally, there's topical, so like what we're doing here. Topical is where you take an idea like, arrangement, and we break it down into various parts. That's topical arrangement. So that's very much what we're doing. Now, the thing about arrangement is, while it is true that, problem solution is a rhetorical choice that the rhetor has made, it's probably not enough in and of itself to have a full, rich paper. If you're writing a basic paper on rhetorical criticism, probably arrangement here is going to need some help. So the thing about arrangement is it can be lovely, but it also can be a little thin. So for example, in arrangement, you might end up using arrangement to explore some other aspect, some placement of devices. So for example, assume that you've got a problem solution. Well, one of the things you might do is you might go through and you might look, hey, when the person talks about the problem, we've got this problem, how do they set that up? How do they convince you what this problem is? How do they convince you about the seriousness of the problem? Is it because there are logical appeals? Or are the appeals pathetic? Or are the appeals citations of authority? Are they ethical appeals? And here's a great question. If you've got a problem solution in front of you, if somebody talks about the problem and it's all logos, if you shift to the solution, what happens? Do they stay logos or do they suddenly change to pathos? Okay, now that's the kind of thing that's really interesting, and that tells us something about how this message works. So logically, I explain the problem until you're frustrated or riled up, and then I hit you emotionally with appeals about the solution. That's a standard problem solution. That's a standard way to use problem solution in your analysis. So think about how your particular device, your particular artifact is arranged, and think about whether or not that helps you understand these other sorts of appeals that we're talking about: logos, pathos, ethos, for example. All right, so those are two arenas. We've talked about invention, we've talked about arrangement. Where we want to spend the rest of our time today is on style.